Hi, this is Liz Moyer, the REDCap team lead at OHSU, and this video is part of our Tips and Tricks series. And in this video, we'll be talking about making changes to projects once they're moved to production. Specifically, we'll be reviewing making changes to forms and making changes to the setup of a project. We'll start off by talking about some requirements and preparations. We'll move on and review operations as they are related to making changes. Then we'll jump into the software and do some demonstrations. The study team is responsible for managing changes to their project once it's moved to production. And for those persons who will actually be making the changes, basics training is required. If you'll be making changes to a survey project, then survey training is also required. And in the project itself, you will need the project design and setup user right. Now, before you jump into your project to start making changes, we highly recommend you review some related information in the REDCap wiki and in the REDCap FAQ. And let's go take a look at that. Jump over here to our browser. And here I am in REDCap, and I already have the FAQ pulled up. And if I click on this button to navigate the page, scroll down a little bit, and you can see there's a whole section for making production changes. And then if we jump over into the REDCap wiki, look at these links over here for navigating the wiki. You can see there is also a link over here to a page that's devoted to making production changes. So please review that information before you start making changes to your project. We also highly recommend that you collaborate with the stakeholders on your project to help you assess the impact of the changes. You want to understand if the changes would introduce a data loss, would introduce issues regarding data integrity or data quality, or would invalidate some functionality that was set up, tested, and vetted when the project was in development. Additionally, we recommend that you collaborate with other project builders to consolidate your change requests. Study team members will be logging into their REDCap project to make any form changes. And there are two types of changes you can make to forms. You can modify existing forms or you can add new forms. The REDCap team is only involved if you submit a change with a critical issue that could result in a data loss. In those situations, the REDCap team reviews and approves those kinds of changes. Now, charges can apply for those kinds of changes if there's a high rate of them. And we consider a high rate to be several or more of those kinds of changes that are submitted over the course of a single day or over the course of multiple days in close range. Charges would start at $100, and the exact amount would depend on the project and the help needed from the REDCap team to resolve the critical issue. Now, with project setup changes, the REDCap team will have to be involved because the settings on the project setup tab are locked down when a project is moved to production, and only a REDCap admin can modify those settings. So if there's something that you want to modify on the project setup tab, email us at redcap@ohsu.edu. Describe the changes that you want to make. We'll assess the changes, look at the impact on your project, and get back to you with either some instructions or a request to meet and talk through them and talk about what the possible charges could be. So we do charge for our help in making project setup changes when the level of help is above and beyond what we can provide at a drop-in. So first, let's review the kinds of changes that typically don't incur charges. These are changes the study team can test in a copy of the project and then work with us at a drop-in to implement. Some examples of these no-cost changes or changes that typically don't incur costs are for longitudinal projects, adding forms or surveys to events or adding new events. For classic or longitudinal projects, making forms infinitely repeatable or enabling or disabling the auto numbering for the unique ID. Now, the kinds of changes with higher impact and that will incur charges are changes like enabling survey functionality or making a project longitudinal or adding consent to a project or enabling an optional module or an external module. Additionally, we would charge if there are a high rate of the typical no-cost project setup changes. And again, a high rate would be several more of these changes in the course of a single month or over multiple months in a row. The minimum charge will be $100, and the total charges or the exact amount would depend on the project and the kind of help that's required from the REDCap team. Now, occasionally, study teams will want to change something about the setup of the project, and the impact is really high, or there is a barrier to making that change because the software doesn't support it. We'll reach out to you if you request that kind of change. It typically would involve using an optional module or an external or advanced module. Set up some time to meet with you and talk about how to move forward. Often the solution is sunsetting the existing project and starting over with the modification or the new module in a new copy of the project. And that wraps up most of the time we're going to spend in the slide deck, and we're going to jump into the software and do some demonstrations. All right, so here we are over in our REDCap project. We can confirm from the project status it's in production. I've got the project setup tab pulled up. We also get a reminder here the project's in production. So with regard to demonstrations, first thing we're going to do is spend a little time on the project setup tab. I want to review with you the most common types of project setup changes folks request, and these typically don't incur charges. Then we will look at the project settings and talk about some of the changes that do incur charges. We'll finish up our demonstrations with jumping over into the online designer and walking through how to make form changes. So the most common project setup changes that folks request, and these typically do not incur charges, involve longitudinal projects, and typically it will be adding a new form to an event, or adding an existing form to an event, or adding a whole new event and making form assignments. So if we click on events, we can see that everything about events is locked down. We can't make any edits to our events at all. And same thing over here for our form assignments to events. So if you need to add a form to an event, add a new event, something like that, email us at redcap@ohsu.edu. Describe the change you want to make. We'll get back to you with some instructions about how to make a copy of your project for testing these changes, and then coming to a drop-in to work with us to implement these changes. The other kinds of changes that you could make and that would involve that same process of testing in a copy and then working with us at drop-in to implement would be making a form repeatable or enabling or disabling auto numbering for the unique record ID. And these apply to both classic and longitudinal projects. So again, if you need to make any of those kinds of changes, email us. We'll send you some instructions about how to test in a copy and work with us at drop-in to implement. These kinds of changes don't incur charges unless there are a high rate of these kinds of changes. Now let's look at these main project settings. They do have a higher impact. If you wanted to make any modifications to these main project settings, they would incur charges. And when you look at these optional modules that are listed here under the auto numbering for the record ID, any modifications here would also incur charges. So the takeaway here, if you're writing yourself some notes, is if you want to make any changes to the setup of the project, any modifications to things listed on the project setup tab, email us at redcap@ohsu.edu, describe the changes. We'll assess the impact and get back to you and either send you some instructions or set up some time to talk with you, talk about the impact of the changes and the kind of charges that the changes could helping you make those changes that you could incur. All right, let's move on to the online designer and look at form changes. So here we are in the online designer. And as always, you want to stop and read any kind of message in a yellow box. And this message is saying, hey, you have to go into draft mode to make changes. If you don't check out this message, then when you click on a form to actually start making changes, you'll get another message about going into draft mode. So let's go into draft mode and talk a little bit about what draft mode is. So you can see we're in draft mode, but our project is still in production. So we're not moving our project back to development. We're not taking our project back, or we're not taking our project offline. We're able to do some work to make modifications while production activities continue on. So draft mode is just holding our changes in draft until we submit our changes for review. But normal production activities can just continue, which means if you're collecting surveys on forms that you're editing, surveys can be collected. If you're entering data on forms that you're editing, data entry can just continue on. Same thing with running reports or exporting data on any forms that you're editing. All the normal operations can continue while you're working to make changes and your changes are held in draft. Moving on to demonstrations. The first demonstration will involve making a change with the critical issue that could result in a data loss. And I'm going to demonstrate for you the most common change that has a critical issue that could result in a data loss. And this involves adding a new option to a radio button, checkbox, or drop-down in such a way that I would relabel data I had already collected. So let's see how this happens. So let me go into my demographics form and I'll jump down here to my race drop down, and let's say we wanted to add a new option. And for the sake of demonstration purposes, and I clicked on let me go back here, I clicked on the yellow pencil to make my edits. So here are my options. And for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to call this a new option. So say I wanted my new option to show up uh, before more than one race. And so I do it something like this. I make my change like this. Let me save this. Now, before you click the button Submit Changes for Review, you should always click the link View a Detailed Summary of All Drafted Changes. This is where you're going to get the helpful information about whether or not your change involved a critical issue and a little bit of information about what kind of data loss. So I'm seeing up here there is a potentially critical issue. I made my changes in a field that contains some data, and an admin would have to review these changes. So these changes would not be automatically approved. And then let's scroll down the page and see if we get a little more information. So it's saying to that race dropdown that there's a possible label mismatch because I changed some labels. And do I want to check and see if it's okay? So let me click on my red button here to compare. And what I see in this pop-up is I had an option with the raw value 7 and the label more than one race that I have given a new label to called new option. And that if the REDCap team were to approve this change, in the 3 records I had recorded the response more than one race, those would be relabeled new option. Now that's not what I want. And for 99% of the folks that submit these kind of changes, that's not what they want. They don't want to relabel existing data that they've collected. They just want to add a new option. So how do you add a new option without creating this kind of label mismatch? Let's go back to our demographics form. And first thing we want to do down here in our dropdown is restore the raw value to the label. We had already collected data on that option. So for more than one race, we're going to add back the raw value 7. And then for our new option, we're going to give it a new raw value. And that's the secret. It's really simple. Anytime you add a new option, you give it a new raw value. The raw value has nothing to do with the order the options are presented. The raw value is there for analysis, and the raw value is there for scoring. This exact example of how to add a new option, I believe, is also addressed in the REDCap FAQ. Let's save that. And now let's view a detailed summary of our drafted changes again. We see that we have fixed the critical issue, that we're not making a modification that would affect some of the data we've collected. We see these changes would be automatically approved. If we scroll down, we see there are not any issues for us to review. So So now if we submit our changes for review, we get a little note reminding us, say, hey, if we added a new field and it contained identifying information, make sure you marked it as such. We'll submit this. And then we get a note that it was automatically approved. And it was automatically approved because we couldn't create a data loss issue. Next demonstration. The next demonstration involves making changes to archive or sunset a field or an option for a radio button, drop down, or checkbox in such a way that I won't lose any data. So let me go back into draft mode and talk about the fields that we want to archive. So say instead of collecting race in this field with these categories, we want to sunset this field, no longer collect data in this field, and add a new field with categories that were defined by the NIH. And then say over here for our gender dropdown, we no longer wanted to collect data associated with the response decline to answer. Now, if we look at our report over here, we can see for gender, we've already got a couple records with the response decline to answer, and we can see we've already got responses for race. So we don't want to lose this data. We just don't want to collect the data in this race field, and we no longer want to collect data associated with the response decline to answer for gender. We go back to project setup. Now your inclination might be, let me just remove these fields and remove that option. So let's see what would happen if you did that. Back in demographics, if I just remove my race field, and if I go to my gender dropdown and remove the option decline to answer, when I look at a summary of my drafted changes, you can see there's a critical issue and that I'm deleting fields that contain data. And if I look down here on my dropdown, that I might lose some data because I'm deleting a choice or an option that already had some data associated with it. And that's not what I want. I just don't want to collect data on that option or in this field. So what's the recommended approach for sunsetting or archiving an option? Let me show you. First, let me just restore things to the state they were before I tried to remove some fields and options. So I'll remove my changes and I'll start over. Jump back into our demographics. So over here, let me edit my race field. It's a very cool option tag. It's called @hidden. And it means that the field will no longer show up on the form. And if this was a survey, it would also no longer show up on the survey, but I won't lose any of the data. So it's just being hidden from data entry or being hidden from the survey form, but it's not being removed from my project altogether. And then for my option, decline to answer, I can use another another action tag called @hidden_choice or @hide_choice to simply hide the choice decline to answer. So with @hide_choice, for whatever choice I want to hide, I simply enter in the corresponding raw value. So the raw value for this choice decline to answer this option is 10. Great. Now when I view a detailed summary of all my drafted changes, I can see there are no critical issues and that these will be automatically approved. So let me submit these changes for review. Again, the reminder about a field with PHI, if there was any field. These get automatically approved. Then we'll double check our report. And I didn't lose any of that data. Decline to answer still shows up here for gender. All my responses for race are still here. But if I go to a form, go to a record, and look at the data entry form, when we look at gender, decline to answer has been removed, and we no longer see that race field. Now I could go make another change and add my new field for race with the new NIH categories. So that is how you sunset or archive a field or an option for which you had already collected data. You use those corresponding action tags at hide choice for an option or at hidden for a field. And that wraps up our demo in REDCap itself. Let's jump back over into the slide deck. So this is just a recap of the steps that we went through to make changes to forms, a reminder of the kinds of changes that could result in data loss, and some tips about making changes. The other types of changes that could result in a data loss are changing a field type. Say you change a field type from a radio button to a text box, or from checkboxes to radio buttons, or through the data dictionary, you try to change a variable name. Those would also result in data loss. And then the last thing I want to say about making some form changes is sometimes you are making a lots of complex modifications. You're going to add some calculated fields. You're going to add some complex branching logic. You want to start piping or using some action tags that have more complexity. And there's no real good way for you to test these in your production project. You'd have to go at it and then create some fake data and then test the calculated field. So sometimes it can be helpful to request a whole copy of your project and then test out your calculated field or test out your more complex action tag with some dummy data to see if it's going to work the way you want it to work, and then make those changes in your production project. If you need to make a copy of your project to test these more complex modifications, reach out to us at redcap@ohsu.edu and let us know, and we'll send you some instructions about how to make a copy. And that wraps up our tips and tricks video for making changes to projects in production. If you download the slide deck, you'll be able to get a link that you can click on to the page on making production changes in the wiki and the section of the FAQ that covers making production changes. All right, well, thanks for watching.